the coolest thing about being a storyteller is the people that you meet and sort of that imprint that they leave on you.
Let's come together right now over social media, shall we?
So you get to tell it, but you actually get to learn from it and absorb from it. It's amazing.
I'm going to show you some of the best things going on right now.
Second offensive possession for Tennessee.
And welcome into Storyteller, our inaugural episode, the old kickoff episode. I am Sky, the host for today, and joining me, the wonderful, the amazing Catherine Chan-Smith from the NFL Network. Thank you so much for joining us, Kat.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Kat has quite the resume. It would take many minutes for me to go through it all, but highlighted, Emmy nominated, multiple Shorty Award winner for all the different social integrations and stuff she has going on at the NFL Network. And you've been at the NFL Network since the beginning.
Yeah.
That is, I mean, a lot of people always say Rich Eisen was the one that left ESPN and took a shot at the NFL Network, but you were the one that left ESPN and took a shot at the NFL Network.
To be fair, I would say that we both left and came at the same time. But yeah, it was a total leap of faith. I mean, I was happy in Connecticut, was really enjoying my time with ESPN, but it was an opportunity to come back to LA, which is home for me. So it was a chance worth taking, and I'd like to say that it's worked out.
And before we dive into all the amazing things you're doing at the NFL Network, let's hear a little more about who you are. You mentioned the ESPN. What is, I guess, if you were to kind of give us the critical moments or the key moments in your professional career, what are some of those moments for you?
Well, it's unlike, I mean, I appreciate that you say that I have a pretty full resume, but actually I think compared to the millennials now, I feel like my resume is pretty stark because I really started my career at ESPN, entry-level production assistant, learned so much there. ESPN has a great, if you're looking into getting into television production or even multimedia production, ESPN just has an amazing program where they're seeding you with a lot of information, giving you training and just teaching you everything you need to learn about production in general and studio production, remote production. So that's where I spent the first 5 years of my career. And after that, NFL Network was a startup. It hadn't even started yet. And a friend of mine who I'd met through ESPN had asked, I'd called her and I said, hey, I'm gonna be home in LA for a weekend, want to get together for lunch or dinner or coffee. And she said, hey, are you still looking to move back to LA? Because my old boss is starting up a 24/7 NFL Network. And so I had no idea what it was about. I took a meeting with my then executive producer, and the rest is history. It was really neat to just be, I think we were the first maybe 25 or 30 employees, and there was no network. My favorite story to tell about the early days, besides the fact that the people are wonderful and still are, but we didn't launch until week 9 of the 2003 season, and for the first 8 weeks we were just doing, every day we were running tests, and we were doing basically like fake shows and running through the exercise of actually producing Total Access, which is our flagship show. And we were also concerned, how do we have a legit 24/7 NFL Network and not start and launch week 1? And my mentor and my former executive producer said, we're gonna be such a big deal and a household brand at some point very soon that no one's gonna remember that we launched week 9. And sure enough, I don't think a lot of people really realize that we took, you know, an 8-week break before we truly launched week 9 and just kind of eased our way into that 2003 season.
Yeah, I forgot that as well. You're like the Houston Texans of 2017. You didn't start trying until week 9.
Exactly. And funny enough, our first Super Bowl was in Houston that year. So.
Oh, there you go. Boom. Full circle there.
Less concussions, though.
Oh, that's a good point. Good point. So you got into the industry, though, as a storyteller, as a production assistant. Where did that drive come from? What was it, something growing up that just drew you to sports? Were you playing sports? What was it that made you want to do, A, the media side, and then B, within the sports spectrum?
I played sports growing up. I played basketball, I swam. I just loved being around sports. I was a huge Lakers fan. My whole family, they're huge Laker fans. Grew into becoming Dodger fans. Like being born and bred in LA, it's hard. It's easy basically to be a fan of some, you know, we have 2 baseball teams, 2 basketball teams now, 2 hockey teams at one point. So it was easy to love sports, and I just loved being around it. In college, when I was at UCLA, took up internships just to keep busy and not get into too much trouble. So I spent a lot of time with with ABC in their sports department, and just loved being around sports in general. Like I watched a lot of local news telecasts and learned. I always found it so interesting that it would start with a certain storyline during the 5 o'clock, and it would just continue to evolve. And when you get to like the 9 o'clock telecast, you get a pretty full story of what happened, good or bad, and it just seemed like that evolution and the journey for that particular story was so interesting. And I think that it was just inherently something that I learned through osmosis more than anything. I don't think that there was this intent to learn about being a good storyteller. I read a lot, and you always know a good story when you start to read those first few sentences and whether or not it captures your attention and how memorable it is and how much it stays with you. So I think I just always loved good stories, and I loved being around people who are good storytellers. My dad is a really gifted storyteller, though he laughs at his own jokes, which is part of the charm. But I just loved, like I said earlier, like this evolution of a seed of a story and hearing all the different layers and how it evolves.
Your dad and I have a lot in common. We both laugh at our own jokes. Speaking of evolutions, the NFL Network, from day one to where it is now, the evolution of when you started, there was no Twitter, there was no Facebook, there was no Instagram. How did you find yourself in this role of, you know, director of social integration? Was it something that was the social stuff, something that you took to or you saw it as an opportunity, like, hey, this is new, I'm going to stick my foot in this door?
Like with most of my career moves, not a lot of what I decided to do was intentional. We didn't have social media, or at least it wasn't such a big part of our production at the time. I was producing shows, and I was oftentimes pegged as like the creative producer that produced like our specialty teases and telling stories, long form, short form. And at the time, my executive producer said, you know, social media is becoming a real force and access to players that we didn't have before. We weren't, you know, no longer do we need to deploy satellite trucks and get crews and spend thousands of dollars just to get a soundbite and hopefully get a soundbite, right? You've worked in news and production for a long time, you know that there's no guarantees. But now players were actively engaging, and they were posting their point of view and how they felt right before. I remember when Joe Flacco tweeted, "Let's go." I mean, it was literally the simplest tweet, but it was right before a playoff game. And but you know, we looked at that and we said, well, that's his statement. If we had a camera, if we had a microphone in front of him, he'd probably say something to that effect. And so we use that as, this is the closest that we're going to get to Joe Flacco and his mindset leading 30, 40 minutes before his first playoff game. And so at the time, my boss just said, why don't we find a way to creatively integrate social media? And so, again, not growing up with Twitter or Facebook or anything, just took to learning as much as I could, met different people and worked with different vendors that taught me a lot along the way. And so merging a lot of what I knew about television production and how it's a visual medium, and having to have a bridge between what was happening on the internet and bringing it and merging it with production and linear television was the challenge. And I'd like to think that the team that I've built and the talented people that I've brought on to do this with me has paid off. Like we've come up with, and we've partnered with great vendors like Tagboard to be able to visualize and merge these two entities.
Now it's time for the lightning round, the only place where lightning strikes more than once, right here in the Storyteller studio. All right, Kat, first lightning round question. And it's pretty self-explanatory, right? Lightning is quick, this is fast, these are quick answers, right? Okay. First question, what job did you want when you were growing up versus what was the first job you actually had?
I really wanted to do color commentary next to Chick Hearn for the Lakers. So since that didn't work out, unfortunately, my first job was at ESPN.
Not a bad first job.
Yeah. Well, no, just kidding. No, it was great. It was great.
You can go down to Staples Center and stand next to Chick Hearn's statue. That's true. Second question. All right. A story that recently moved you.
A story. So, two stories. The first one, which is a little more dated, but it was the Raptors super fan, and it was a story on Twitter. It was a Twitter thread about, I think his name is Nav Bahati. I don't know if I'm even saying his name right, but it's just the story about how he is a first-generation immigrant, and he worked his way to own his own car dealerships. I know it's lightning round, right? But it's like, I love the story. If you've never heard of it, but he's a Raptors fan. He has not missed a game since 1995, and he buys tickets for underprivileged children. I mean, not even just underprivileged, but just children in general, so that they can experience a basketball game. And he was there when they won, and he's just goodness, and I love that story. And then this morning, also on Twitter, there was a fan story that it's called like ESPN Fan Stories, and it's about a guy who tweeted at Sergio Garcia 204 times to be his caddy, and it finally worked. It was amazing. So again, it's a short, like little short story, but it's awesome.
And the next question, if you could make a documentary, what's a story you want to tell that hasn't been told yet?
Okay, there's so many good ones out there, but I think most recently, since we recently had the newest class inducted into the Hall of Fame, I've had the privilege of meeting Blair Buswell. He's one of the sculptors that sculpt the bust for the Hall of Fame. He actually did Ed Reed's bust this year, and I felt like he just did such an incredible job encapsulating who Ed Reed was with his hair, and it's just amazing. I think it's an art. It's an art, and it's a true talent to be able to look at a photo, look at someone, and sculpt their being. Because I think we've seen a lot of them where they don't look anything like them. So it's one of those things where you have one job. But Blair does it so well, and I know that he's done hundreds of the busts that are currently in the Hall of Fame in Canton, and I feel like his story probably has been told, but it needs to be retold because it's been added to, and there's been more to it. And his process, I'm just so curious about his process and how he puts everything together and how he's able to shape and mold and sculpt these busts.
I can think of the perfect network to tell that story too. That I don't know which one, but there's one out there. Yeah. Last one, the best stories are, and in 3 words.
Best stories are simple, memorable, and told. I think if you don't tell it, we would never be able to decide for ourselves whether or not it's a good story.
That was amazing. I agree. I agree with all those. All right, moving past the lightning round now. That was great job. Now, you said at the end the best stories are told, and you've been telling a lot of stories, and you're really the brainchild behind how some of these stories are told on NFL Network. So just diving in on a couple of them that have really stood out and seem really interesting. One of my favorite things about Twitter is when something incredible happens and you get everyone just like quick reaction, like, oh, wow. Yeah. And the moment that stands out is the Stephon Diggs play in the playoffs a couple years ago when Minneapolis throws the ball, catches it. It's the Minneapolis miracle or whatever you want to call it. And you guys did an incredible job of telling that story and telling what I love is everyone reacting to it. And how did that all come about?
That one it was truly a team effort. I mean, from one of our producers, Seth, who's a huge Vikings fan, to Emily Mitchka, who is a super talented graphics artist for us, and she's one of our producers that season. And so there's a story within the story. So everyone sees Stephon Diggs score this amazing touchdown, and we notice on our tweet deck that everyone's just going off, and there's just hundreds and thousands of mentions, and not just from fans, but from verified users like, athletes and just all sorts of different backgrounds of people. And so and we're always looking for different ways of telling a story, and we knew that there was a story within the story. And it collaboratively, the team decided, what if we created sort of a tweet deck on top of the video so that people get the full sense of what just happened and what we just saw. We all saw the video, but then how do we, again, merge these two entities from the internet to linear television? And the thing is, our linear television audience skews older than the audience that's on social or digital in general. And so we were trying to find a way, how do we tell a story that would make sense and sort of feed into this older demographic that may not be on Twitter and it would be new to them. And so they worked together and they talked about this. They're like, what if we just did an overlay, a really simple overlay using Photoshop, and just add all of the tweets and count the mentions so that people knew, if you didn't know football and you didn't understand, that it is really a pivotal moment and how important it is that everyone is joining the conversation. Oftentimes what we're trying to do is not just merge these two platforms, but we want to do something which someone in our office, Henry Hodgson, has called stealth learning. It's where the intention of creating something entertaining, but there's learning behind it without really knowing it, and it's the best kind of learning because you're really being entertained and it's committing to your memory. And I feel like for people who, like my parents, who aren't necessarily on Twitter, or some of our older demographic from our linear audience that isn't on Twitter or social media for that matter, is able to see that there's a whole different space that has these conversations about what we're watching, and it might intrigue them to either get an account and sign up for Twitter or social media in general. They're learning something new and they're being introduced to something in a really entertaining way. So I love that it was more than just merging, it was creating this new concept and new idea to some people who may not be aware of what social media offers.
I think that's really cool. And then they see the reactions too, and it's like, oh, I had the exact same reaction.
Exactly.
I basically tweeted from my living room, even though I didn't have Twitter. That's what maybe somebody could say there in that moment.
Yeah, because there's so many people on Twitter that are wallflowers. I mean, look, I don't tweet that often because I don't have breaking news and information like Ian Rappaport does, but there's oftentimes that I read, go through my Twitter feed, and I think that's exactly how I feel about either a certain game or a certain player, or just news in general, or fun memes that are being circulated. So it's kind of neat to feel like you're part of something without actively having to do anything. If you're a Twitter wallflower, you can kind of just be more of someone perusing and seeing what the conversations are being had out there, and feeling like you're relating to someone somewhere that may not be, in your immediate vicinity.
Another moment that this popped in my head was when, after the draft, 2019 draft, and Kyler Murray gets picked first overall, and I think of NFL Network. You know how ESPN always says like they have all the mascots walking around? NFL Network just must have all the NFL players just walking around all the time. So you have Kyler Murray. Obviously, you're on site. Did this happen on site or was this post-draft?
This was on site.
It was on site in Nashville. And you have all these different influencers and fellow teammates and former teammates chiming in, and you're able to bring it all to life. And I just think it was an amazing moment. And how did that one materialize? We're going to show it here, but how did this all come together?
So we had a set backstage, and when you see Kyler Murray walk in here with Taylor Lewan and Kay Adams, it had been probably 45 minutes to an hour after he was drafted. And the coolest thing was, and this was a cool moment for us and for Tagboard, I would say collectively, which is something that I love, but he had been going through a car wash of interviews, like on stage with Dion, then he went to ESPN, and he went through local news agencies as well. So by the time he got to us, he had been probably through at least 10 or 11 interviews. And right here, Kay was able to show him a few things that he had done throughout the day. He did the Plinko, which was an activation that the NFL did with Twitter, which was on the red carpet. And then the coolest moment that you'll eventually see is he saw the video of himself getting called and walking up on stage and shaking hands with the commissioner, something that he had not, he experienced himself, but he did not get to see the video at all. And it was the first time that he got to see it. And it was really neat to be in the room with someone who is at his mountaintop, 21 years old, working for this moment his whole life and his family's life even, and being able to watch him experience that. It's sort of this out-of-body experience, and he was just like any other person in that room. He seemed so humble at that moment and just taken aback by, like, he literally stopped, and we stopped the interview because he was just watching himself. And I didn't, I obviously don't play professional football, but I would like to think that if that was a pivotal moment in my career and being able to watch myself live it, and go through the motions of shaking hands and hugging your family, like, it's just so incredible. I think I was so happy for him because I think that there's so many people who dream of that moment and a few people that see it to fruition, and there's a lot of people that it escapes them. And so it was really cool to be able to see in that moment that he was able to relive it.
Yeah, and it stuck with me too from his standpoint. You mentioned the car wash of interview here, and even leading up to the process with Kyler. And he's not the loudest, and he's not necessarily the most comfortable person in those situations. But in this, you saw a little more of the real Kyler, and I thought that was just added to how awesome this activation was.
The draft is just an amazing event. It's where dreams come true, and it feels like a privilege to be able to see something like that up close and personal. So.
That's so cool. And as I'm watching this too, some like buzzwords that stick out, especially in this day and age, for the real-time factor of getting them that quick and having the content ready to go. And then the interactive factor as well. I mean, real-time, interactive are a couple words that I think are a big part of social integration these days. How do you play into those things? Or do you think of that as you're building this kind of stuff?
Always. With all the different platforms, and Twitter's real time, then Instagram is Instagram. It's about making you happy and beautiful photos and imagery, and then Facebook is more for like conversations. There's a platform for everyone, and there's a different you use a different platform for different purposes. There is the digital counterpart to our team, which is led by Dave Feldman at the NFL, and his team is amazing. They post all of these pivotal moments pretty quickly, and because we partner with Tagboard, we're then able to filter and cultivate and curate all of the content that we need into a display so that we can show someone like Kyler Murray the content that we found. There's other tweets about him. Baker Mayfield had tweeted at him, a bunch of different players welcoming him to the NFL and congratulating him. So it's really neat to be able to pull all of that content into one space and show someone. I think he was so humbled. I mean, I was standing just a few feet away from him, and I think he was really taken aback at just the reaction and how he was embraced by the NFL. And it's just the best part of the job to be able to see someone, their first introduction into the NFL.
As you're talking about that, I'm kind of thinking too, a lot of times in this industry, you don't necessarily see that reaction, because if you're doing a feature, you spend all this time, you play it, and you have no idea how anyone's going to react. You don't know how the player's reacting, and that's kind of changed, and something that you can now have a little more of see the personal side and the reaction in moments like this. Yeah,
and we also say that it's like a real-time focus group. Oftentimes the idea is post something, produce something. If it gets a lot of likes and a lot of engagement, great. And if it doesn't, it's okay, because there's just so much content anyway that the nice thing is there's always that safety net. Like, if a tree fell in the forest and no one saw or heard, like, does it make a sound? It's okay that if you post something and it doesn't garner like hundreds and thousands and millions of likes, the important thing is to actually do it. I think when I first started working in television production, you wanted to get it right because you had one shot, and you had, when I was at ESPN and I was aspiring to be a storyteller. It was, feature producers were sort of like the wide receivers. It's like you were the divas, you were like this glamour position, and it took years for you to be able to be a feature producer. It was this really coveted position. And I was fortunate that I was able to learn from a lot of them. I was never a feature producer at ESPN, but watching them, and they had, for NFL Countdown on Sundays, you had about 4 minutes to tell your story. And you're working with really talented producers, editors, talent to tell a story, and you had to get it right. And we didn't have Twitter then. There wasn't a second life where you could possibly post it elsewhere. Maybe on the website, but for the most part, you had your TV moment, and that was the moment that you were going to clip and send to your parents and your grandparents and share with your family. And so it was a different experience at that point. You had to get it right. And I remember when I got to the NFL Network, I used to think I have to get it right because I have one shot. And that's when it started to change, when my boss and my mentor there, his name's Eric Weinberger, he had said, it's okay. Like, do the best you can and just put it out there, because like I said, the best stories are the ones that are told. You just have to tell it at some point, and you're your own worst critic. And so I share that with my team now. There's times that we feel like, is it perfect? But it has to get out there because it needs to be timely, because you don't want to miss that window, and everything moves so quickly in social anyway. So finding that balance between timeliness but getting it right, and telling it right, and producing it with the right imagery and the right feel, it's all important. And I think it's a skill that not everyone has, but it is a skill, and it's like a muscle that you can continue to build. And the more you do it, the better you are at it. And sometimes you're going to have a speed bump moment here or there where you tell some great stories and get a bad one every now and then. But for the most part, you learn from everyone that you tell, and you learn from even the people that you meet. I find that the coolest thing about being a storyteller is the people that you meet, and sort of that imprint that they leave on you, because they've traveled and lived a totally different journey than yourself, and the knowledge that they impart on you is, so you get to tell it, but you actually get to learn from it and absorb from it. It's amazing.
All right. Well, Kat, thank you so much for joining us for the kickoff episode, our first round pick, you could say, to come on here and help us kick this Storyteller show off. And you just do amazing work down there at the NFL Network, and you gave even better answers, so thanks for stopping by.
Well, thanks for having me. It was really, really fun, and I'm excited to see all the other guests that you'll have sitting in this chair.
Yeah, we're going to learn from the first one, and so hopefully we just keep getting better and better and better on our side. From that side, it's going to be hard to top. It's going to be hard to top. So thanks for stopping by.